Trump's one big, beautiful bill. What's in it for you? Hello, members, super savers, and Bond Course fans. I hope you're healthy and well. Early Thursday morning this past week, after what must have been a very long night, the House of Representatives narrowly passed its version of the OBBBA, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the official name for what we've been referring to on this channel as President Trump's Budget and More bill. The bill was approved by just a single vote, 215 to 214, but passed is passed, and the budget will now go to the Senate for further discussions. Even if everything goes as planned, it will be a while before the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is signed into law by the president. For all practical purposes, this is still a draft budget. Nonetheless, our assumption is that the overall direction of the bill will not change that much anymore, even though some individual provisions may be modified in the give and take that will now surely still happen both in the Senate and between the Senate and the House over the next few weeks. So, with that in mind, here are the three topics that we'll be covering in today's video. 1. How much will Trump's 7 tax priorities cost? 2. How does the House want to pay for the tax cuts? And 3. What would our budget deficit be as a percentage of GDP? And what happens next? As usual, here's our front of video disclaimer. For a detailed disclaimer, please refer to the end of this video. Let's dive in now, folks. How much will Trump's 7 tax priorities cost? So, our team here at Diamond NestEgg put in quite a few hours before Memorial Day weekend to analyze what the numbers look like for President Trump's 7 tax priorities, as well as for the proposed main initiatives to at least partially fund the expected shortfalls with either more revenue or less spending. And we started with the numbers that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget published on its website. From what we can see, these are likely the best estimates that we can get at this point in time. But please keep in mind that these estimates are just that, estimates, and that the budget may change anyway in the next phase. And do note that we did our own breakdown of the numbers to understand how they align to President Trump's 7 tax priorities. So, here's our analysis of how much would President Trump's 7 tax priorities cost federal taxpayers over the next 10 years. In this column, we have the president's 7 tax priorities. No tax on tips, meaning gratuities. No tax on Social Security. No tax on overtime pay. The renewal and extension of the 2017 tax cuts from the president's first administration, including SALT. Tax cuts for Made in America products, and deductions for car loans. If you want more details on any of these items, please refer back to these previous videos here, linked below in the first pinned comment. So taken together, the president's 7 tax priorities, as they currently stand, would cost federal taxpayers $4,365 billion, or almost $4.4 trillion over the next 10 years. The biggest position by far is the renewal and extension of the provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the tax cuts from Trump's first administration, including SALT, at $3,855 billion. But let's park that for now. We'll do a deeper dive in a minute. These other 6 priorities with the amounts in light yellow are all limited through 2028, as we explained in our last budget update video. This means that the numbers don't really look that scary as they stand here. $40 billion for no tax on tips, $72 billion for the new extra deduction for taxpayers over 65, which comes instead of the full tax exemption for Social Security benefits that was initially proposed. A more substantial $124 billion for no tax on overtime pay, and an even bigger $216 billion for a variety of tax incentives to promote manufacturing in the U.S., and $58 billion for making some car loans tax deductible for American-made vehicles. Taken together, these 5 provisions add up to $510 billion over 10 years, a fraction of the cost of the extension of the 2017 tax cuts. Keep in mind, though, that there may be a lot of political pressure to extend these 5 provisions when the time comes after 3 years, in 2028, which may make these numbers here go up significantly. And many industry observers expect just that. But this is where we stand at the current time. Let's now have a closer look at the biggest position as promised. This $3,855 billion, or almost $3.9 trillion cost for the permanent extension of the 2017 tax cuts and some new proposed tax reductions on top. Here's our breakdown of the $3,855 billion cost. The largest number here is from the extension of the 2017 rate cuts, the lower tax rates across all brackets at $2,177 billion, followed by keeping the scope of the AMT, the alternative minimum tax, narrower at $1,414 billion. The next 2 items are actually new tax cuts that should benefit a good part of the population. A hike to the standard deduction costing $1,308 billion, and an increase of the child tax credit at $797 billion. The extension of the pass-through deduction will cost $820 billion and is essentially a benefit for small businesses who are taxed in their owner's personal tax return. And the estate tax cut here for $212 billion lowers inheritance taxes. Now, the next 2 lines, the repeal of personal and dependent exemptions and the cap on SALT, a cap or limit on how much in state and local taxes can be deducted from the federal tax bill. These are actually measures from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that increase taxes for taxpayers in higher rate brackets and high tax states. They were included in the 2017 bill to fund at least some of the tax cuts back then, just as our current budget proposes some measure to increase revenue. We'll get to these later. And because the repeal of personal and dependent exemptions and the cap on SALT were part of the same bill, they would have expired together with the 2017 tax cuts at the end of this year. But because the One Big Beautiful Bill essentially proposes to extend all the 2017 tax cuts, it's probably only logical that it would extend these 2 provisions as well, even though they increase the tax burden for some. And if you wonder why these numbers are red here, as in reducing the deficit, that's essentially because it's about extending old tax increases. There is more technical complexity to how this actually works, but we'll leave it at that for today's video. And a final word about SALT. There's still a discussion on increasing the amount of state and local taxes that can be deducted from federal taxes, but most of the proposals would still put a limit to it, even though the cap might be increased, meaning that not all, but a good part of this old tax increase from 2017 will most likely survive and be made permanent. And finally, this last line here summarizes a host of additional smaller changes to taxes and tax rates in the budget that, taken together, should bring the Treasury a net $87 billion in additional revenue versus the baseline over 10 years. And here you have it. Adding up all the changes to the tax code around President Trump's 7 tax priorities, the federal budget will face this net shortfall of $4,365 billion, or almost $4.4 trillion over the next 10 years, which brings us nicely to the next section of today's video. How does the House want to pay for the tax cuts? So, as we already discussed in our last budget video, here's how the President and Congress propose to pay for the latest tax cuts. And let's add one more column to show the additional estimated revenue in billions over 10 years for each of these items that we were able to find. President Trump's first proposal to close the carried interest tax loophole that currently allows partners in hedge funds, private equity funds, and similar vehicles to get a large part of their compensation at the privileged capital gains tax rates. This was unsuccessful. So let's put a 0 here. The president's second proposal to eliminate tax breaks for sports team owners is part of the budget bill. However, we couldn't find a number for it in the mountain of research that we went through, so we'll leave this as unavailable or 0 for now as well. I suspect we will be updating this table again as the bill moves in closer to its final version, and it will be interesting to see how much this provision actually helps with the deficit. Let's keep going now with the proposals from Congress. The current budget would phase out tax credits for electric vehicles, bringing in estimated additional revenue of $360 billion over 10 years. It would also phase out tax credits for renewable energy and battery production, resulting in estimated additional tax revenue of $237 billion over 10 years. Be aware that the number for the phase out of renewable energy tax credits could increase if the final budget decided to bring forward the phase out from 2029, as was promised as part of the final negotiations in the House. So some potential good news here from a deficit point of view, although it will definitely not be enough to fix the entire shortfall. Now, the next two provisions that the House of Representatives added to reducing the deficit increase the taxes that universities and foundations pay on their annual net investment income and introduce a new 5% tax on certain payments to residents of foreign countries. The numbers we're talking about are much smaller here, at an estimated additional tax revenue of $23 billion and $22 billion over 10 years, respectively. Moving on now to the last proposal on this list from Congress: reduce spending for Medicaid and SNAP, food stamps. This would generate a whopping $799 billion in estimated additional revenue in 10 years, by far the most significant number on this list. And because these $799 billion are the largest initiative to fund the tax cuts and have attracted their fair share of publicity and criticism as well, let's have a closer look at the details of the Medicaid and SNAP cuts. So here you can see that savings from Medicaid would amount to $529 billion over 10 years, mainly driven by savings of $273 billion from stricter work requirements for able-bodied and childless beneficiaries, as well as $172 billion from stricter eligibility and enrollment criteria. Savings from SNAP are smaller at $271 billion, with roughly half of it, these $128 billion here, coming from requiring states to provide matching funds, share the cost, so to speak, and the rest mainly from these $96 billion in, again, stricter work requirements. So that was the breakdown of Medicare and SNAP cuts. Again, the biggest number over the next 10 years on this list, bringing the additional total revenue to an estimated $1,442 billion over the next decade. And if we look at this side by side against the estimated cost over the next decade from President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, we can see that there is a fairly big gap, which brings us nicely to the next question for today's video. What would our budget deficit be as a percentage of GDP? And what happens next? If we take this $1.4 trillion in additional revenue over the next decade and add in an additional $0.4 trillion in revenue from countless other provisions in the budget, including from the restart of collection on student loans, this gives us a total additional revenue number of about $1.8 trillion. Deduct from this the $4.4 trillion in estimated costs from President Trump's 7 tax priorities, and this gets us to these roughly $2.5 trillion of total primary deficit impact overall from the One Big Beautiful Bill. Now, this primary impact of $2.5 trillion in deficit increase over 10 years is even slightly below the $2.8 trillion cap that the House of Representatives has imposed on itself. So as it currently stands, things are even a little bit better or less bad than some had feared. That said, primary impact means the impact before the interest payments on all that new debt needed to fund the increased deficit gets taken into account. So we need to add a bit more than $500 billion for additional interest over 10 years. And there you have it, savers. If the House proposal was enacted as it stands now, it would increase our deficit by a bit more than $3 trillion over 10 years. At this point, some of you may be wondering what this means as a percentage of GDP. In other words, how much worse does this make our deficit when we compare it to our national economy overall? So, in its latest outlook from January, the CBO, the government's Congressional Budget Office, had already predicted that the federal government would run persistent budget deficits of between 5.2% and 6.5% over the next 10 years. And that was still under the assumptions from the former Biden administration. The Nonpartisan Committee for Responsible Federal Budget now estimates that the One Big Beautiful Bill in its current form would boost the deficit to around 7% of GDP, more than double the target of 3% that Secretary of the Treasury Bessent is targeting as part of his 3-3-3 plan that he announced when he took office. For more details about that, check out this latest video here from Ava on Your Financial Journey. So, a persistent budget deficit of 7% is not great. And as we often say on this channel, clearly not sustainable forever. At some point, we as a nation will need to do something about it. But I'll save that topic for another day and another video. For today and this video, the next steps for this budget will probably be to fine-tune the proposals a bit without changing the fundamental outlook. The Senate will now discuss the proposal from the House of Representatives, and both chambers will need to align themselves and agree to one final version that they can then send to President Trump for his signature. As the Wall Street Journal reports, Republicans are aiming to get the bill to Trump's desk by July 4th. However, they add, the real deadline might be a bit later. The bill includes an increase in the debt limit, a step that Congress must take by August when the U.S. could run out of cash and borrowing capacity to pay all its bills. Our best guess here at Diamond NestEgg is that we might have a budget by August, which will probably provide some clarity and avoid a government shutdown. But this budget will, in all likelihood, also keep growing our deficit. Who knows though, right? The only certainty these days seems to be that things are uncertain. The 20-year and 30-year T-bond yields have closed above 5% 3 days in a row now, and it remains to be seen how the administration may react if markets move too much in the wrong direction. President Trump has shown us before in the ongoing tariff saga that he does take the market seriously and can correct his course fairly quickly if the markets get too jittery, or yippy, as he might say. Speaking of which, congratulations to all our members, super savers, and Bond Course fans who were able to pick up some of those 5% yields at this past week's 20-year T-bond auction, as well as those of you who participated in the 10-year TIPS auction. The 2.22% real yield was the second highest in more than a decade and a half. And in case you want to take advantage of the current attractive rates to build out your bond portfolio, then check out this video. Here on our bond courses, use coupon code BONDS2025 to get an additional 10% off of a popular bond course bundle before the end of May. There's a few days left before the savings go away. The 10% coupon code BONDS2025 can also be used to purchase Bond Beginners or Bond Masters individually. I've linked all the details on our bond courses and our YouTube Super Saver membership below this video for your convenience. All right, members, super savers, and Bond Course fans, I hope you enjoyed today's video and learned something new. And see you again very soon with more brand new wealth building content for your financial journey.